Tonight, we're very lucky to have two ladies who have actually met up together to come and talk to us. Can I first of all remind you a couple of housekeeping to start off with? Can I please ask that everybody make sure that they've muted and switched off their videos on their actual Zooms? It may be easier if you put your Zoom into speaker mode so then you can see who's actually talking, because both Julia and Helen have actually met up together and in the same room. They are socially distanced, so they do look quite distant, quite far apart, and they're on the edges of the screen. It will make life a little bit easier. At the end, please can you make sure that you send your evaluation forms back to Di. It will be very much appreciated, because obviously the feedback we get we can then use for future calls. And secondly, at the end, I will be having, I've got some slides to share with you with some information which the ladies have put together for us. That information, I'll just whiz through it, but you will be able to find it on the TOF website tomorrow. So don't worry about trying to write down the actual website addresses, because we'll get all that information you'll be able to get that information from there. So our two speakers tonight, we've got Julia Faulkner. Julia is a paediatric dietitian at Musgrove Park Hospital in Taunton. She has a 6-year-old who was born with OA TOF, and she has written many articles for us on weaning, and she's spoken at our conference in 2018. And again, you can watch the videos on that on our website. She's also a member of our TOF medical advisory group, and through TOF, Julia has now become involved with a patient-led European research project called The Patient Journey, and she's the lead for the feeding and nutrition part of this project. We've also got Helen Marks. Helen. Helen is clinical lead for paediatric speech and language at Bristol Children's Hospital, with a specific interest in babies and young children with swallowing difficulties as a result of upper airway problems. She is the speech and language therapy representative on the TOF medical advisory group. And many of you will have read her contribution in the chapter of the TOF book on feeding, swallowing problems in babies and children born with OA TOF. So, welcome ladies. Thank you for your time again tonight. It's very much appreciated by us. So we'll get started with the questions that we've been sent. So the first one, when is the best time to start weaning our tofflings who are born early? She's 1 month, corrected today.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. So I hope you can all hear me. So it's Julia here, paediatric dietitian. So there's no real best age. The best thing to go for is if they're showing signs that they're ready. So one of the signs that they're ready would be that they've got really good head and neck control. They should also be able to maintain themselves in a seated position, although they might need some support with that. They should be interested in food and starting to put things in their mouth and actually chomp down on them. And normally if you're eating, they're sort of leaning forwards, wanting to become involved as well. It's typically between 5 and 6 months corrected age, but there's more information about this on the BLISS website. That's BLISS.
Thanks for that. Next question. My 13-month-old is NG fed and now shows a safe swallow. I'm very nervous and don't know where to start. I'm anxious and worried about choking him or getting something stuck.
So I think I'll take that one, Duncan. Thank you. So I would suggest that you start with what has been shown to be safe. So I'm assuming that if there was a question about the safety of the swallow, that there was a speech and language therapist involved at some point to diagnose that. So normally the safer foods are the smoother purees, but I think if there's been a question about safety of swallow, then you probably need to go back to your speech therapy team, start with what we know is safe, and then they will help you move forward with that.
I am a new mum and would like to hear more about managing weaning with potential dysmotility issues.
Okay, so so dysmotility. So for anyone who doesn't know, this is when the esophagus doesn't work properly. So it might not even work at all, so squeeze food down, or it might work in an uncoordinated fashion. So a bit might be squeezing food down, and another bit might be trying to squeeze food down lower down, which means food actually gets stuck in the middle. So the easiest way, I think, as a parent to think about this is to actually imagine food moving down the esophagus into the stomach by gravity. And when you think about this, it helps you imagine what the easiest foods are. So the easiest foods are thin purees, because they're just going to drip down easily. So, and also when your baby's able to take drinks, often little sips with food to help thicker food go down, or lumpy food. So start with thin purees and encourage your baby to manage sips of fluids. That way, as you progress with weaning, that will help. I would also model this behaviour yourself. So when you're eating, hopefully eating with your baby, I would be drinking frequent sips to show your baby this is what you do, it's normal behaviour. Thank you.
Okay, next question. I need some ideas for how to progress from purees for my TOF child who is 11 months old.
So I think we'll probably answer this a little bit together, and possibly the next question is quite similar. So we would say maybe try to finger foods first of all, rather than going to more lumpy textures. And we call the finger foods that are the easiest, we call them bite and dissolve foods, and they're things that you take a little bit off, you bite a little bit off, and they go quite soggy and they dissolve very quickly. So for children that haven't, Julia's got some demonstrations here of some so that's everyone will probably identify that as a skip. So it's good coming from a dietitian, this sort of stuff, because it's not the most nutritional. That this is like an organics puff, and this is really good because the baby you can actually hold it, and can begin to feed themselves. So these are foods where things won't break off in the mouth, so the risk of choking is minimized, because by the time all the saliva's mixed in with it, it goes quite soggy and it's a bit easier to swallow. So this is a Whatsit, for those of you that remember Whatsits, but they're all really good for this first stage of progressing from purees. You can also have things like soft fruit and soft veg, particularly this time of year. Again, Julia, my assistant on my right here, has got some examples of,
what's that, Helen?
So that is a tinned carrot, or a carrot that's come out of a tin, but look how soft it is, and it's the right size for babies to pick up and just munch on a little bit. And there's very little, because it's quite soft, see, once it's in the mouth, it just so we do get very messy, you have to excuse us. It does these are ideal for introducing finger foods. And on the website, there's Julia's done a really good introduction of finger foods as well, so all these things will be on the website. Thank you. So hopefully that's helped with that question.
Okay, and then how do we go about increasing the texture for people that have started weaning even further, so they start getting to more solids?
So that's similar, really. So again, it's keep going with the bite and dissolve finger foods and soft, easy to eat foods like the carrots, and we've also got some tinned green beans, which you'd think would be stringy, but actually these are actually really soft. Again, I can just mush them in my hands and get them all over my laptop, but they're easy to mush, so they're quite handy.
So these things are all quite good at letting our babies develop their chewing without having anything that's going to cause a problem or likely to get stuck. So once they've had lots of practice with this, then they'll have more mature chewing, which hopefully then they can start moving on to more solid foods, more chewier foods, I guess.
Yeah, and you can gradually puree foods less, so they've got some lump, some texture, and also things that are really easy, like flaked fish. So fish you can flake up into little bits so they can pick it up and put it in their mouth and do easily. Overcooked broccoli florets, so they can pick them up, but like school dinner style, and then when you put them in your mouth they go really mushy. And the we put a link on the website, haven't we, Helen, to the International Diet and Dysphagia Standardisation Initiative, which is a speech and language therapists talk for grading through different textures, and you could follow that on the TOF's website as well.
So there's lots of examples there of different levels of textured food and thicknesses of drinks and things. So that's a very useful resource. IDSI is the short name for that.
Okay, thanks for that. How do I get my TOF child to eat more varied diet and build his confidence?
Okay, so so it's just confidence. So what has affected their confidence? So have they been ill? Have they recently had a frightening choke, or what TOF parents call sticky, a food bolus obstruction? So then obviously it's natural for them to lose confidence. So you go back a few steps to what they were managing previously and coping with well. So maybe they've moved on to lumps and they've had a sticky and they've lost confidence. So you just go back to the smooth purees again and gradually build up again. And try to introduce a range of different tastes at the texture that they find comfortable and easy. And it can take 10 to 15 times of actually trying something before a baby or child decides that it's okay, they like it, they build their confidence with it. So it's just all about exposure to all these different things. And it's really hard, but try not to put pressure on them. Just let them sit and join in with family meal times and copy a bit of what you're doing. Unfortunately, you might have to eat similar food to what they're eating, so they know that it's okay. Like, mummy and daddy are eating this as well, my brother's eating this. Yeah.
Okay. My son is 14 months old, diagnosed with TE fistula, and can only eat crunchy solid foods like Cheerios and crackers. Anything like small pieces of fruit, sauteed vegetables, or softened beans, he gets stuck and vomits. Why is this, and how can I get him eating soft, solid foods?
I think that sometimes pieces of food can be too small, and that sometimes we need to give slightly larger pieces of food so that you can encourage some chewing. So yeah, I think I remember we used to have, I used to work with a surgeon that said food had to be 2 centimetres by 2 centimetres by 2 centimetres, and they were serious, and parents followed that. But I think now we know, when we understand a little bit more about chewing, that actually it's okay for it to be slightly bigger, because the smaller it is, I think that if it's not chewed properly, the more likely it's to get stuck. So we would say maybe use slightly bigger pieces, big enough so the child can pick it up and feed themselves. Sort of a chip, an oven chip size. That's sort of my, so it's chunky but not crispy. And also to encourage sips of water when you're eating. That helps if things get a little bit stuck. Sips of water or drink, whatever they're having. Have you got anything?
No, I think the same thing, because to me this sounds like like Helen said, that maybe it's a small piece of soft food, they're swallowing it rather than actually chewing it. And that's why it's getting stuck. So like Helen said, a bigger piece would prompt a chewing action, and then hopefully it won't get stuck. But yes, frequent sips of water, and if they're older, fizzy drinks actually help get stuff down if it's stuck as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. How do we balance the child's relationship with food against meeting their feeding developmental milestones? Do we push to build skills or try to keep mealtime stress-free?
I think it's a difficult balance. It's a challenge for parents, and I think the priority really is to keep things as stress-free as possible, and start with what you know they can eat, and gradually increase. Try not to put too much pressure on yourself or to have too high expectations of moving too quickly. And it's okay if there are times when maybe they're a little bit poorly and they go back a little bit. That's absolutely fine. We know with these children that they are a little bit up and down with their feeding, but if you can if you can go with that, and if they need to go back to slightly more pureed food, that's fine. And as soon as they're a little bit better, gradually increase it again. And we there's an American occupational therapist, and she talks about dancing on the edge of the infant's tolerance. And basically what that means is that you push them slightly, so they're just coming out of their comfort zone. But it's okay to go back into their comfort zone when they're not so well, and then as soon as they're able to, you push them back out of their comfort zone, and that's how you gradually increase their tolerance of lumps, of different tastes, of textures. But it's okay, because we know that physically our children need that, and physically things sometimes change, so that we just have to adapt with them.
So basically, don't worry about the milestones, just go with your child and how your child's coping with things. Also, I know a lot of TOF parents report this, the random days where your child just seems to get everything stuck. I had a couple of these. So we're just used to keeping the store cupboard, things that I knew my child could cope with easily. So you might keep soups in, or the milkshake drinks that are fortified with vitamins, and then that made me like less anxious, like, okay, we're just a milkshake day today. And usually it was associated with something like just a cold, or maybe teething, but you get through those days and you get back on it again, and it's all good.
Okay, thanks for that, both. Next question you've probably answered, but there might be some other examples you can think of which foods are safe for TOF children.
I think I would say it really depends on their age, their history, their level of feeding skills. I think it's really hard to say one particular, one type of food is better. I think what we would say is if you're worried at all about choking or about the safety of your child's feeding, that's when you probably need to ask for probably a speech and language therapy assessment. But that's quite a general question, really, isn't it? About which
anyone on the Facebook group, you'll hear some parents say, oh, I'd never give my child that, because they know that their child would absolutely get that stuck, they wouldn't cope with it, whereas other parents would be, but my child's fine with that. So it is very individual.
Okay. Can TOF babies have things like chia seeds in their food?
Yeah, so yes and no. So I've got some chia seeds here in case you can't see. They look a bit like, they're sort of similar size to poppy seeds. So when they're like that, they're fine. You could mix them in with a yogurt or something and give them immediately. But if you soak them, which is I think called a chia pudding, they go like this. If you can see that. So if you've got a dysmotility esophagus, there we go, it eventually goes down. So and there will be some children out there who would cope with that, but it wouldn't be the first kind of food, would it, Helen, we've been talking about. So you could cautiously do that if you felt your child would be able to manage that, but I would stay away from it, certainly initially.
Yeah.
Can we give tiny bite-sized sandwiches?
So I think if your child can deal with bread, then because a bite-sized sandwich has got bread and a filling in, so you're mixing potentially two textures. So I think if you know they can deal with bread, then I would say yes, but not really. Again, like the question before, that you don't want them to be too small, you don't want them to be tiny, you need them to be able to hold on to it and to bite into it. I would avoid claggy fillings. I think, if you know what I mean by claggy, a bit like what we've just seen with those chia seeds that are, that it's just really stodgy, because bread can go quite stodgy.
Yeah, like peanut butter.
Yeah, peanut butter would be a no-no. So I think wholemeal bread is probably better than white bread, because white bread in itself sometimes gets a bit claggy, doesn't it? And it tends to get a bit stuck in the roof of your mouth, in the sides of your mouth, and I think any child that's learning to chew might have problems with that.
Yeah, so I've got some examples of what I used to do when I worked out my child was fine with bread. Was then we did sandwiches. We did like the wafer thin corned beef, because corned beef comes apart really easily. Tuna mayonnaise, grated cheese with mayonnaise, hummus, fish or meat pastes, other wafer thin meats. Yeah, that was it. I mean, I used to always do fingers and cut the crust off, so you had to bite off and chew and actually chew it.
Okay. Can we give solid foods as popsicles if a baby is ready and interested in food, but we haven't had our pre-solid TOF checkup, food checkup?
So I actually had to look up what popsicle might be. And I've come to the conclusion that you're talking about like a fruit puree that's been frozen into like an ice lolly. So firstly, I would say if you're expecting to be seen by your medical team before you start solid and you haven't, so maybe an appointment has been pushed back because of all the changes with COVID, I would phone your team and keep phoning them and leaving messages until you get an answer if that's what you think. But some centres may not do a check before weaning, and you may be fine to go ahead. But if you're expecting to speak to your centre first, then I'd definitely phone them and check it's okay. I would be a bit worried about sometimes because cold. I'm not sure babies how they would handle that. But also because it's a sucking action, if they suck and a lump comes off, that's going to move back quite quickly and could get stuck. So the safest foods to start off with are the thin puree. So anything slightly thicker than the breast milk or formula that they're currently managing is going to be the safest thing to start off with. And you're going to be talking about a few teaspoons and lots of different tastes to get a range of tastes in, including bitter foods.
Okay, that leads us nicely on to the next question. How do you introduce new foods to a toddler that is becoming fussy? How do you get them to try new foods?
Okay, so fussy toddlers is actually a normal phase of development for all children. So it's actually, there's a posh word for it, food neophobia, but it's just a basic fear response, and it tends to peak at around 2 years of age, which is why poor old toddlers get this reputation. So so like any fear or phobia, gradually increasing their exposure will help them to get over it. So keep offering even if it's refused. So the more exposure you give, the more they see you modelling this behaviour as well, you eating the foods, talking positively about the foods, the more willingness to taste it they're going to have, and then they're more likely to like it eventually. Again, it can take 10, 15, 20 times of trying something before they actually decide they accept it and they like it. So I wouldn't pressurise them. I'd praise them even for eating a really small amount. And exposure to the food can mean all sorts of different things. So it might be just getting involved with growing it, or cooking with it, or doing messy play. So I won't subject Helen to some messy play, but you could be dipping your fingers in purees, putting them on your face, putting them on your lips, you doing it, letting your child do it to you, and just anything about food. And this is something I tell my husband about, not making negative comments about food at the table. So everyone needs to be positive about the food, and ideally eating together. So we put down a website link for this. So the childfeedingguide.co.uk, that's on the TOF's website. That's a very good site to go and look at for dealing with problems such as this.
Thanks for that. My son is 18 months old and likes apples and pears, but what would be the best way to give them to him? Peeled, cut or softened, or just as they are?
I think any of the above, other than a hard, you know, if the apple or pear isn't ripe, so I would avoid a hard apple or a hard pear. You can also try grating them. Grating up, and that's quite easy then for them to pick up, or steaming them a little beforehand. So again, going back to our chip size pieces, so if you cut them into that sort of size so they can pick them up, so it's firm enough for them to pick it up, but then it just goes mushy when it's in their mouth. Take the pips out if you can. And you could also, depending, I mean, if he's 18 months old, you could start to encourage him to use a fork to stab into, you know, so moving on a little bit from finger feeding, to use a fork to stab into the piece of apple or pear, again keeping it ripe or steamed so it's quite soft, because that's another, you know, that's a skill moving on from spoon feeding.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I know the answer to this next one, but what are alternatives if they don't eat what you've given them?
Okay, well, it depends why they aren't eating. So if it's because they're not eating because it's a fear or phobia, then yes. If it's just because they're not hungry, which is often what I get in my house, it's no. So I would keep the food back and offer it again when they say they're hungry. But it depends why. So that really goes back to why you think your child's refusing.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to move on to some questions now about chewing and swallowing. How do I encourage chewing properly, then swallowing? Our TOF often takes a mouthful and then holds it in his mouth for a while, then swallows and gets it stuck.
So I think the combination of chewing and swallowing, again, is something that our children have to learn. So again, we would start, I think probably there's a bit of a theme with what we're saying this evening, is to start with some easy chew foods, so they're not struggling with the chewing. So the bite and dissolve, the soft veg. I think if you've got any problems with swallowing, that this is something that we can't, you know, because it's not, we can't answer individual cases. Again, I think you need to ask for a SALT assessment. So if you're worried that they're not swallowing, or you're worried that it's getting stuck because they're not swallowing, then that's a little bit out of what we can advise on this evening. But you need to ask for a SALT assessment, really. That's or speech and language therapy assessment.
Okay, thanks for that. How do you tell the difference between a sticky and their normal TOF cough stroke weaning gag?
Okay, this is quite difficult actually, because again, this will vary slightly between individuals. So I'm just talking from a parent perspective here. So, but your normal TOF cough, so that's what occurs in between meals, not associated with feeding. That's probably quite a dry cough, usually self-resolves. So a gag, so this is when they're eating, and this is completely normal, all babies do it. So they move food back, they get slightly freaked out, they've moved a lump back and they're not ready to swallow it. So they gag to bring it forwards again and either spit it out or chew it again and then swallow it. Whereas a sticky, or what when you're talking to the medical team, they'll call food bolus obstruction in your esophagus, they have actually swallowed the food and it's sat there not going anywhere. So a baby might look, it's important to remember they are breathing, so try and stay calm, because they're breathing. They may look like they're struggling a bit, they may look worried, they may be trying to be sick, they may actually manage to bring it up themselves, or you may have to go into your choking first aid and use that to help the baby dislodge the food. It's really important where you can to try and stay calm, because if your baby gets frightened and they associate eating with something frightening happening, this is what's going to put them off eating more in the future. So it was amazing actually what you do when you face with it. I managed to be quite calm during it, but then afterwards I'd have to leave my baby with someone else and go and have a little cry, and then it was all fine.
Probably very scary when it happens for the first time, but I think it's really important to remember that the sticky, it's getting stuck in the food pipe and not in the food pipe and not in the airway, so the baby or the child can still breathe. It's easy for me to say, but that's I think trying to stay calm is probably the hardest thing out of all those things to do. And we, again, on the website, we've put some links to the St John's ambulance that have done a lovely video about what to do if your baby, you know, if something gets stuck, choking, or if you get really worried about choking. So that's, well, you've probably have done, most of you would have done that when you've been in hospital. You might have had that before you've been discharged, but that's a really good refresher just for you just remind yourself of the things to do.
Okay, thanks for that. When managing stridors associated with tracheomalacia, what impact on feeding does this have?
So for those of you that maybe don't know about tracheomalacia, I guess it's relatively common in our children, and basically it's a floppy lower airway. And what happens is when you breathe in, because the airway is quite floppy, it collapses in and it puts some resistance on your breathing, and that makes a noise called stridor, which I think is what this person is talking about, and that's a bit that sort of noise. And in some of our little ones, that's quite normal because we know they've got tracheomalacia. But because it puts more effort on your breathing, sometimes it knocks out the coordination between swallowing and breathing. So when you're feeding, you have to, it's a very fine coordination. And I think if that's the case, if we're talking about stridor, and if the stridor gets worse with feeding, again, I think that's when you need to have a SALT assessment, because I think if your coordination is being put out, then you need some very specific advice about how to manage that.
Next one's about nursery. My daughter is 3 years old with a long gap away and has had a delayed repair. She has a peg and overnight feeds. She can have solid, but is very reluctant. I need advice on suitable nursery lunches for her.
I think this is a little bit about the question before about the stress around meal times, and I think we would say try and stick to food that she's comfortable with, that isn't going to stress her out, and that she can eat without too much difficulty. I think nurseries can be quite noisy and distracting, and I think they're probably not the place to introduce new foods or different foods or more challenging foods, which sometimes is a bit of a decision because you want possibly your child to be eating the same as the other children. But I think I think familiarity is the key here, and it's better for your child to have a little bit of something that she can eat well and be comfortable with and not have any problems with, than for her to maybe be pushed a little to have something that's different that she might get a bit anxious about, because that just might then make the problem a little bit worse.
Yeah, and I've got some practical things, like from parent perspective. So it's probably a good idea to meet with the nursery. It sounds like you're already familiar with the nursery, so meet with them, make sure they understand your child's needs and what they need to do in an emergency as well if she does get food stuck. It can be helpful as well to do some videos at home of maybe the possibly unusual noises she might be making when she's eating, so the nursery staff know that's normal for your child and not to panic if she does that. And you might want to go in and show them how you feed her initially, what to do, and to make you feel comfortable as well as her with eating in a different setting.
Okay, thanks. We are currently gastronomy fed, and we introduce purees with some success. However, my son is still reluctant to take the bottle. He pushes it away. Is there anything that they can do to help this?
I think my first reaction to this is whether you've tried a little cup with your son without a lid. I think sometimes bottle feeding, sometimes we can stop bottle feeding, particularly if children are moving on to purees. I would put, if they like puree, I would put a little bit of the puree with some water in a cup, just an open cup without a lid on. Maybe give him some off a spoon to start with, so he can see that it's the same food that he's been having off a spoon, and then just see if he will take a little bit from a cup. Only aim for a little bit at a time. Some babies, children just don't do bottles, and that's okay. They don't need to establish bottle feeding in order to move on to, you know, that won't hold them back from moving on with their cup feeding or their solid feeding.
Okay, support and referrals. Who should I speak to if I'm worried about my child's progress with feeding?
I would say, depending on their age, probably I would go to your health visitor, back to your surgeon or your GP. So, and if it's about, again, if it's about swallowing and moving on, you need to request a speech and language therapy assessment. Some speech and language services will accept parent referrals, so you just need to find out where you make that referral, and the health visitor should help you with that. I think if your concerns are more about nutrition and moving on with foods, then obviously a dietitian would be the best person to speak to. But again, the process would be the same, either the health visitor or your surgeon. If you can't get through with anyone else, the surgeon should be able to signpost you in the right direction.
Okay, thanks for that. What should I do if my child isn't interested in food?
Okay, yeah, so this is quite similar to some of the previous questions. So again, it's about why. So why aren't they interested in food? Is it just because they've got fear or phobia? Is it just because they're not hungry? So, and I would worry as a dietitian, so are they meeting their nutritional needs at the moment? So if there's concern that they're not meeting their nutritional requirements, then I would definitely ask for a referral to a dietitian. And you, as Helen's just said, you can go to your GP, health visitor, or surgeon or another member of your team to ask for a referral. But the basic things that you could do is just a bit of food play and talking about food in a positive way. But it really depends on why they're not interested in food, which is quite hard to make a sort of judgment on, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, we've time for just a couple more questions. So we have a 2-year-old, TOF, and she's a bit behind with speaking. She has a lot of trouble chewing stuff, and we assume this is why. How can we work with her beyond chewing to help her develop speech more? She does speak, but seems to have trouble enunciating.
I think I think there's no clear evidence that if you have problems with chewing that will affect your speech. But I think if you, and a 2-year-old, probably there are really quite wide norms about how much they should be speaking, how clear it should be. It's, you know, it's really, the norms are really very wide. So but I think, again, if you've got any concerns, you probably need to have an assessment or speak to someone who can listen to your child, because it is very likely that they are developing within their norms, but because they've maybe been a bit slow with their chewing, that people are assuming that there's a link. And I think there isn't a lot of hard evidence to say that there actually there is a link. So again, you need to have a speech therapy assessment.
Okay, and a quick one for Julia. How do you know when your TOF child needs a stretch procedure? Are there any criteria? Now, as a parent now of a 19-year-old who had 33 dilatations, my gut reaction is actually you just sort of get to know your child and you know when they need the dilatation and get in touch with your team. But I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. So basically, obviously, so a stricture is a narrow in the esophagus, and you naturally have a slight narrow there anyway where the join was, but if it strictures up, so narrows even further that it's difficult for food to pass down through, then it would need a dilatation stretched up again. So so the signs of that would be your child struggling with foods that they've previously managed, so maybe more likely lumpier foods, but actually they're coping fine with their drinks, their milk, their and purees, but they're struggling with lumpier foods and consistently struggling with lumpier foods, not the odd day where they're teething and just getting stuff stuck. So those are the signs So more food getting stuck more regularly and generally getting more lumpy food stuck. And it is then a case of calling your team and saying, hello, you know, I think my child needs to be looked at because I think they might need a stretch. And sometimes it's just not clear, because I know I sometimes was absolutely convinced that my child needed a stretch, and when we went in and they checked him, he was fine, and then you feel guilty because you've taken them in for a procedure they didn't need. So it is hard.
It is hard, and I think I think it possibly is easier if they're only bottle breastfeeding, because their feeding just goes down very, very quickly. And milk dribbles out the mouth, and they tend not to deal with their saliva. And I think you very quickly, as you say, Duncan, very quickly learn those signs and almost anticipate, you know, what's happening. So I think it's a little bit easier when they're just on milk. But with food, I think I would say they're consistently having problems. So what we talked about this evening is that there is a lot of variability, isn't there? You know, and our children do have good and bad days. But I think if you need a stretch, things are going to deteriorate quite quickly and quite significantly. And I think certainly where we're familiar with, the surgeons are more than happy to have a phone call and to see a child, you know, they'll see them that same day, and that's not a problem at all. So even though you might feel guilty because they don't need to stretch, I think they would rather you take the child in and exclude that than for you to be worrying at home and for them to, you know, everybody to be getting more stressed and for, you know, for it to be getting worse.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with COVID, you shouldn't be worried about going in if you think your child needs.
No, just take them in.
Right, thank you for both for that. It's been very informative, and obviously, hopefully, we've got through pretty much all the questions that people have asked. So, right, I'm going to, if I can find it, share my screen with everybody, and hopefully you can see now. It should be saying thank you for watching, and we've got some additional information. Unlike previous ones where we've sort of just had the question and answers with the consultants, we're going to try something new tonight. And let's have a 10-minute sort of discussion between yourselves. Now, the only way I think I can do it is by using the reaction button. If you do a thumbs up, and then I can sort of go to that person if you want to ask a question, and then somebody else within the room can then have a go at answering it, have a conversation between ourselves and see what goes on. If it works, great. If it doesn't, well, we've tried and we've not lost anything, but we thought we'd give it a try. Can I please remind you that can you make sure you return your evaluation forms to Di? Obviously here on the screen now you've got the St John's Ambulance, Baby Choking and the Bliss website. Like I said at the start, these are going to be available on our website anyway come tomorrow, so you'll be able to pick those up, and then you've got the feeding guide, and then you've got the TOF leaflet there. And I think there's one more, that's it. And then you've got transitional foods. So those will be available, so you can read those. So Helen, Julia, thank you very much for your time and obviously answering all our questions. Much appreciated, and obviously we'll hopefully perhaps do another session again, possibly like this, or even ideally face-to-face. So thank you for your time, and obviously stay safe.